What's going on, everybody? This is the Blockchain Backer, bringing you the latest cryptocurrency news and analysis. And today I wanted to take a look at the United States dollar. I was looking around on Twitter and just over the last few days, and there's been a lot of posts about the petrodollar, right? We've seen that oil has drastically fallen this week. We've seen it go down to zero on a day. And right now it's hovering between $11 and $13 per barrel. And what does that really mean, right? And then we started, seeing a lot of stuff about petrodollar and all that stuff. And, there seems to be a lot of confusion on what the petrodollar is. And I thought in this video, we'll dive deep into what the petrodollar is and what makes the US dollar the world reserve currency. And will this have any impacts on the United States dollar remaining the world reserve currency? Because, well, what's the reason for why the United States dollar is the world reserve currency? And it's all tied to oil. So what does that mean if oil is collapsed down to 0.11? Does that affect the petrodollar? Does that affect the United States standing as having the world reserve currency? So I'm going to try to keep this video as factual based as possible without many of my opinions in it. I'm really just going to try to read different things and we're going to go into it, and I figure I can educate my audience more on what the petrodollar is, how the United States came to be the world reserve currency, and is the world reserve currency, the US dollar, in danger now that oil has fallen all the way down to $11? And will that have any type of impact on cryptocurrencies like XRP or Bitcoin or any type of precious metals like gold or silver? We've gone through this chart several times on my channel. This is the DXY, the US dollar currency index, and the 2017 cryptocurrency bull run took place during this fall of the US dollar. And throughout the history of this channel, on multiple occasions, I've forecasted that the dollar will actually fall down to the DXY index will fall down to about 78 to 80. So let's take a look at the petrodollar, kind of figure out exactly what the petrodollar is, how it came to be, and let's see if we can draw any conclusions from what's happening with oil to what could potentially happen with the dollar. Again, I'm going to try to keep this as few opinions as possible and really just kind of read this stuff to you guys to help educate, because I was up late last night trying to read all of this stuff, and I thought, okay, I'm just going to present this, and you guys can do your own research and come up with your own conclusions. But I think there was a lot of misguidance and misunderstanding on what the petrodollar is, why the United States is the world reserve currency, and I figured, why not? This is a great opportunity to go ahead and review it together. So, okay, here we go. Petrodollars. Now, before I get started, let me tell you this. I am much more of a mathematician than a reader. So excuse me if I mispronounce some words, especially in here when we're going to be talking about a lot of different countries and a lot of different leaders and names and cities that I don't know how to pronounce. So you'll have to forgive me if I do mispronounce something. But there we go. Hopefully I can just lay that out there first, and now we can get started, and I'll start reading all this stuff to you and show you the information that I found useful. And hopefully at the end of this, we're all educated better on why the United States dollar is the world's reserve currency and what a petrodollar is. What are petrodollars? Petrodollars are US dollars paid to an oil exporting country for the sale of the commodity. Put simply, the petrodollar system is an exchange of oil for US dollars between countries that buy oil and those that produce it. The petrodollar was a result of the oil crisis in the mid-1970s when prices spiked to record levels. It helped increase the stability of oil prices denominated in US dollars. The term regained notoriety in the early part of the 2000s when US oil prices rose once again. Although petrodollars initially referred primarily to money that Middle Eastern countries and members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, received, the definition has broadened to include other countries in recent years. Understanding petrodollars. Petrodollars are oil revenues denominated in US dollars. They are the primary source of revenue for many oil exporting members of OPEC as well as other oil exporters in the Middle East, Norway, and Russia. Because petrodollars are denominated in US dollars or greenbacks, which is the same thing as dollars, their true purchasing power relies on both the core rate of US inflation and the value of the US dollar. This means petrodollars will be affected by economic factors the same way the US dollar is affected. So if the value of the dollar falls, so does the value of petrodollars, and thus the government's revenue. So far at this point, we've established that petrodollars are simply just dollars, United States dollars, and they're the dollars that are exchanged when oil is being exported from a country. So there's been an agreement made that whenever oil is exported from an oil exporting country, it will always be exchanged with US dollars. And this term has been called petrodollars. History of the petrodollar system. The origins of the petrodollar system go back to Bretton Woods Agreement, which replaced the gold standard with the US dollar as the reserve currency. Under this agreement, the US dollar was pegged to gold, while other global currencies were pegged to the US dollar. But because of massive stagflation, President Nixon announced in 1971 that the greenback would no longer be exchanged for gold to boost economic growth for the United States. That led to the creation of the petrodollar system, where the US and Saudi Arabia agreed to set prices in US dollars. That meant any other country that purchased oil from the Saudi government would have to exchange its currency into US dollars before completing the sale. That led the remaining OPEC countries to follow suit and price their oil in US currency. Key takeaways. Petrodollars are US dollars paid to an oil exporting country for the sale of oil, or simply an exchange of oil for US dollars. Petrodollars are the primary source of revenue for many OPEC members and other oil exporters. Because they are denominated in US dollars, the purchasing power of petrodollars relies on the value of the US dollar. When the greenback falls, petrodollars do too. Petrodollar recycling. Now, this is going to be interesting. Before we get into this, I want you to remember this right here, petrodollar recycling, because we are going to come back to that, and I'm going to show you some charts because there's something very interesting about this that I think is important when it comes to the price of oil and how the economy is doing. Petrodollar recycling. The petrodollar system creates surpluses known as petrodollar surpluses. Since petrodollars are basically US dollars, these surpluses lead to larger US dollar reserves for oil exporters. So they have more dollars. These surpluses need to be recycled, which means they can be channeled into domestic consumption and investment, used to lend to other countries, or be invested back in the United States through the purchase of bonds and treasury bills. This process helps create liquidity in financial markets in the United States. So, when oil prices are high, it means that these oil exporting countries make a nice profit. And what do they do with that profit? They invest that profit. And a lot of times they invest that back into the United States in treasury bills, bonds, and it helps create liquidity in financial markets in the United States. The collapse of the petrodollar system? With the decline in the purchasing power of the greenback, some nations started to debate the benefits of the petrodollar system. Countries like Iran, Russia, and India have considered shifting the base value of their exports in their own currency rather than the US dollar. In late 2017, China announced that it considered moving to price oil in the yuan. Because it's the world's biggest importer of oil, China saw it as logical to shift to price the world's most important commodity. Venezuela dropped the petrodollar in 2017 and began pricing oil in euros and the yuan. Okay, so that's kind of a basic rundown right there of what petrodollars are. Petrodollars are dollars exchanged for oil. Now we're going to read some more articles here and more write-ups that are essentially going to say some of the same things over and over again, but I think it's important that we do in order to get a full understanding of what's going on here. Petrodollars and the system that created it, from the balance. The petrodollar is any US dollar paid to oil exporting countries in exchange for oil. The dollar is the preeminent global currency. As a result, all international transactions, including oil, are priced in dollars. Oil exporting nations must receive dollars for their exports, not their own currency. In addition, most of them own their oil industries. That makes their national income dependent on the dollar's value. If it falls, so does the government's revenue. As a result, most of these oil exporters also peg their currencies to the dollar. That way, if the dollar's value falls, so does the price of all their domestic goods and services. That helps these countries avoid wide swings in inflation or deflation. Petrodollar system. The petrodollar system is tied to the history of the gold standard. After World War II, the United States held most of the world's supply of gold. It agreed to redeem any US dollar for its value in gold if the other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar. Other countries signed onto this deal in the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. It established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. On February 14, 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt initiated the alliance with Saudi Arabia. He met with the Saudi king. The United States built an airfield at Dhahran, excuse me for mispronouncing that, in return for military and business training. This alliance was so critical that it survived subsequent years of differences of opinion over the Arab-Israeli conflict. Important, the 1945 agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia cemented the relationship between the dollar and oil. The petrodollar was born. In 1971, U.S. stagflation prompted runs on the dollar. Many countries asked to redeem their U.S. dollars for gold. To protect the remaining U.S. gold reserves, President Richard Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. As a result, the value of the dollar plummeted. That helped the U.S. economy as its export values also decreased, making them more competitive. A falling dollar hurt oil exporting countries because contracts were priced in U.S. dollars. Their oil revenue dropped along with the dollar. The cost of imports denominated in other currencies increased. In 1973, Nixon asked Congress for military aid to Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The newly formed Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries halted oil exports to the United States and other Israeli allies. The OPEC oil embargo quadrupled the price of oil in 6 months. Prices remained high even after the embargo ended. Petrodollar recycling, here we are again. In 1979, the United States and Saudi Arabia negotiated the United States-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. They agreed to use U.S. dollars for oil contracts. The U.S. dollars would be recycled back to America through contracts with U.S. companies. These companies improve Saudi infrastructure through technology transfer. That increases imports, provides higher wages for government employees, and boosts the local economy. The rest is used to improve the nation's finances. They recycle their petrodollars through sovereign wealth funds. They use these funds to invest in non-oil related businesses. The profits from these businesses make them less dependent on oil prices. Here are the world's 5 largest petrodollar recyclers ranked by assets. And there you have it. The coming collapse to the petrodollar? Question mark. The United States uses the power of petrodollars to enforce its foreign policy, but many countries don't fight back. They are afraid it would mean the collapse of the petrodollar system. For example, the United States sanctioned Iran for refusing to halt its development of potential nuclear weapons. Similarly, it hit Russia with trade embargoes for invading Crimea and creating a crisis in Ukraine. China called for a replacement of the US dollar as the global currency. Ironically, it is one of the largest foreign holders of the dollar. China influences the dollar by pegging its currency, the yuan, to it. Will these rogue attacks cause a dollar collapse? No, at least not for the near future. That is because there is no good alternative. The euro is the second most circulated currency, and it has undergone attack from within thanks to the Eurozone crisis. Warning, there is a threat to the petrodollar as the world shifts from oil to renewable energy. Nations are limiting greenhouse gas emissions to fight global warming. As they shift to electric vehicles and solar or wind power generation, it threatens the profitability of oil-producing nations. The United States has lost its competitive edge in these technologies to China and the European Union. As a result, the petrodollar may lose its role as the world's dominant currency. So this is interesting right here, right? So I'm going to try to keep my opinions out of it as I read this, but just kind of think to what's going on in the world. Nations are limiting greenhouse gas emissions to fight global warming. As they shift to electric vehicles and solar or wind power generation, it threatens the profitability of oil-producing nations. As a result, the petrodollar may lose its role as the world's dominant currency. So as oil loses value and is used less, the United States loses power. What are we seeing right now? We're seeing a complete collapse in the price of oil. So okay, let's move on. How petrodollars affect the US dollar. All right, now this will be the last one that we're going to read, and then we're going to start really kind of talking about this and then looking at charts together. So here we go. I think after we read this one right here, we'll have reiterated some of the same pieces of information, and hopefully at that point you've kind of soaked it all in and have a little bit of an understanding at this point. If you were kind of struggling at some point, you may already know way, way, way more than I do, but just in case you didn't know anything really about how all of it works, hopefully this gives like a little bit of an idea of what's going on. So, how petrodollars affect the US dollar. After the collapse of the Bretton Woods gold standard in the early 1970s, the United States struck a deal with Saudi Arabia to standardize oil prices in dollar terms. Through this deal, the petrodollar system was born, along with a shift away from pegged exchange rates and gold-backed currencies to non-backed floating rate regimes. The petrodollar system elevated the US dollar to the world's reserve currency, and through this status, the United States enjoys persistent trade deficits and is a global economic hedge money. The petrodollar system also provides U.S. financial markets with a source of liquidity and foreign capital inflows through petrodollar recycling. We've said that multiple times now. However, a full explanation of the effects of petrodollars on the U.S. dollar requires a brief synopsis of the history of the petrodollar. History of the petrodollar. Faced with mounting inflation, debt from the Vietnam War, extravagant domestic spending habits, and a persistent balance of payment deficit, the Nixon administration decided in August 1971 to suddenly and shockingly end the convertibility of U.S. dollars into gold. In the wake of this Nixon shock, the world saw the end of the gold era and a free fall of the U.S. dollar amidst soaring inflation. Key takeaways. Petrodollars are dollars paid to oil-producing countries for oil. The emergence of the petrodollar dates back to the early 1970s when the U.S. reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia to standardize the sale of oil based on the U.S. dollar. Petrodollar recycling creates demand for U.S. assets when dollars received for oil sales are used to buy investments in the United States. Recycling of petrodollars is beneficial to the greenback because it promotes non-inflationary growth. A move away from petrodollars could potentially increase borrowing costs for governments, companies, and consumers if sources of money become scarce. Through bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia beginning in 1974, the U.S. managed to influence members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, to standardize the sale of oil in dollars. In return for invoicing oil in dollar denominations, Saudi Arabia and other Arab states secured U.S. influence in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, along with U.S. military assistance during an increasingly worrisome political climate, which saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the fall of the Iranian Shah, and the Iran-Iraq War. Out of this mutually beneficial agreement, the petrodollar system was born. Benefits of the petrodollar system. Since the most sought-after commodity in the world, oil, is priced in US dollars, the petrodollar helped elevated the greenback as the world's dominant currency. With its high status, the US dollar enjoys what some have asserted to be the privilege of perpetually financing its current account deficit by issuing dollar-denominated assets at very low rates of interest, as well as becoming a global economic hedge money. For instance, countries like China, who hold vast quantities of U.S. debt, have voiced their concerns in the past about the possible dilutive effects to their asset holdings should the dollar depreciate. However, the privileges associated with being able to run persistent current account deficits come at a price. As a reserve currency, the United States is obligated to run these deficits to fulfill reserve requirements in an ever-expanding global economy. If the United States were to stop running these deficits, the resulting shortage of liquidity could pull the world into an economic slump. However, if the persistent deficits continued indefinitely, eventually foreign countries will begin to doubt the value of the dollar, and the greenback may lose its role as a reserve currency. This is known as the Triffin dilemma. We'll come back to that. Here we are again, petrodollar recycling. The petrodollar system also creates surpluses of US dollar reserves for oil-producing countries, which need to be recycled. These surplus dollars are spent on domestic consumption, lent abroad to meet the balance of payments of developing nations, or invested in US dollar-denominated assets. Again, invested in US dollar-denominated assets. This last point is the most beneficial for the US dollar because Petrodollars make their way back into the United States. These recycled dollars are used to purchase U.S. securities such as Treasury bills, which creates liquidity in the financial markets, keeps interest rates low, and promotes non-inflationary growth. Moreover, the OPEC states can avoid currency risks of conversion and invest in secure U.S. investments. I keep getting drawn back to this right here. This particular petrodollar recycling stuff keeps pulling me right back to it. I think we got to read it one more time. The petrodollar system also creates surpluses of U.S. dollar reserves for oil-producing countries who need to be recycled. Why did they get surpluses of U.S. dollar reserves? It's because they're selling oil at a profit, right? If you have excess, that means you're making a profit. These surplus dollars are spent on domestic consumption, lent abroad to meet the balance of payments of developing nations, or invested in U.S. dollar denominated assets. This last point is the most beneficial for the U.S. dollar because petrodollars make their way back to the United States. These recycled dollars are used to purchase U.S. securities such as Treasury bills, which creates liquidity in the financial markets, keeps interest rates low, and promotes non-inflationary growth. So what happens when oil is $11 a barrel? What happens when nobody is buying oil? What happens with the petrodollar? Are these oil exporting countries making a profit and capable of reinvesting their money back into the United States to provide liquidity for the markets? It also states here that these recycled dollars are used to purchase U.S. securities such as Treasury bills, which creates liquidity in the financial markets, keeps interest rates low, and promotes non-inflationary growth. So what's going to happen to inflation if there's no liquidity being provided from oil? And the only way we're able to provide the liquidity is by printing money at the Federal Reserve or hitting the little button on the computer. So I want to head back on over to the Triffin dilemma and how it affects currencies. Robert Triffin's dollar prediction. In October of 1959, a Yale professor sat in front of Congress's Joint Economic Committee and calmly announced that the Bretton Woods system was doomed. The dollar could not survive as the world's reserve currency without requiring the United States to run ever-growing deficits. This dismal scientist was Belgium-born Robert Triffin, and he was right. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971, and today the dollar's role as the reserve currency has the United States running the largest current account deficit in the world. For much of the 20th century, the US dollar was the currency of choice. Central banks and investors alike bought dollars to hold as foreign exchange reserves, and with good reason. The US had a stable political climate, did not experience the ravages of world wars like Europe had, and had a steadily growing economy that was large enough to absorb shocks. The key takeaways are that Robert Triffin believed the dollar could not survive as the world's reserve currency without requiring the United States to run ever-growing deficits. A popular reserve currency lifts its exchange rate, which hurts the currency issuing country's exports, leading to a trade deficit. A country that issues a reserve currency must balance its interests with the responsibility to make monetary decisions that benefit other countries. Another reserve currency replacing the dollar would increase borrowing costs, which could impact the United States' ability to repay debt. A new international monetary system could potentially help countries maintain a reserve currency status. Reserve currency considerations. By agreeing to have its currency used as a reserve currency, a country pins its hands behind its back. To keep the global economy chugging along, it may have to inject large amounts of its currency into circulation, driving up inflation at home. The more popular the reserve currency is relative to other countries, the higher its exchange rate and the less competitive domestic exporting industries become. This causes a trade deficit for the currency issuing countries but makes the world happy. If the reserve currency country instead decides to focus on domestic monetary policy by not issuing more currency, then the world becomes unhappy. Reserve currency paradox. Becoming a reserve currency presents countries with a paradox. They want the interest-free loan generated by selling currency to foreign governments, and they need to be able to raise capital quickly because of high demand for reserve currency-denominated bonds. At the same time, they want to be able to use capital and monetary policy to ensure that domestic industries are competitive in the world market and make sure that domestic economy is healthy and not running large trade deficits. Unfortunately, both of these ideas, cheap sources of capital and positive trade balances, usually can't happen at the same time. This is the Triffin dilemma, named after Robert Triffin, an economist who wrote of the impending doom of the Bretton Woods system in his 1960 book, Gold and the Dollar Crisis, The Future of Convertibility. He pointed out that the years of pumping dollars into the world economy through post-war programs such as Marshall Plan was making it increasingly difficult to stick to the gold standard. The country had to achieve this by instilling international confidence through a current account surplus while also having a current account deficit by providing immediate access to gold. Issuing a reserve currency means that monetary policy is no longer a domestic-only issue, it's international. Governments have to balance the desire to keep unemployment low and economic growth steady with its responsibility to make monetary decisions that will benefit other countries. The reserve currency status is, thus, a great national sovereignty. So that's pretty interesting right there, right? Let's read that one more time. Issuing a reserve currency means that monetary policy is no longer a domestic-only issue. It's international. Governments have to balance the desire to keep unemployment low and economic growth steady with its responsibility to make monetary decisions that will benefit other countries. The reserve currency status is, thus, a great national sovereignty. So it's the responsibility of the country that has the world's reserve currency to take care of its own country, but also to take care of other countries as well. Right now, in the current economic climate and political climate, we are receiving a strong message that the United States is focusing more on a nationalism type of mindset, focusing more on itself and not everybody else. I think we can all agree to that. Simply having the mindset that it's America only and the rest of the world doesn't really matter, well, that's contradictory to what we're reading right here, that it's important for the country with the world reserve currency to not only look after itself, but it also needs to be looking after other countries' interests too. Again, issuing a reserve currency means that monetary policy is no longer a domestic-only issue, it's international. Governments have to balance the desire to keep unemployment low and economic growth steady and its responsibility to make monetary decisions that will benefit other countries. The reserve currency status is, thus, a threat to national sovereignty. So by being the world reserve currency, it can impact your own country, or the United States in this example of what we're living in right now. There become points where you have to say America is not first because we have the responsibility of the world reserve currency. So if the rest of the world doesn't have faith that you are putting them into consideration and you're only putting the United States into consideration, does that make people want to get off of the world reserve currency, the US dollar? But okay, I think we've done enough reading at this point. So what I wanted to show you was this chart right here. On the top, I have oil, West Texas oil. On the bottom, I have the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And I noticed that these move in harmony together very, very identically. And you could see that just where these tops come in, where these bottoms come in, you could see right here, and then it just kind of grinds up. And you can see where this top happened right here back on October 3rd, 2018. Oil started falling, and along with that, the stock market fell as well. Then it rose, so did the stock market. Then it fell, so did the stock market. Rose, and then just this little grind up here at the end. And you can see how these moves just work so smoothly together and fall. Now, why would that happen? Does it have to do with what we were just discussing earlier regarding the petrodollar recycling? That when oil is up, these oil exporting countries make more profit, giving them a surplus in petrodollars or dollars, in which they reinvest back into the United States economy. When the oil price is down, they're not injecting liquidity into the market. On January 8th, oil began its crash, and it really started to break down, and yet somehow the stock market held itself while oil already started crashing beginning on January 8th. Then once it finally broke through this support, that is where the stock market actually went. It went good night. Now, what's been really interesting is you could see how oil finds its bottom right down here, and so does the stock market. And then oil bounces and then completely turns on itself and crashes down into oblivion. And as we know with the futures contract, it went to zero on Monday, but now it's still hovering in that $11 to $14 range throughout the day. However, the stock market did not follow it. Yet we've seen that it follows every move, every top in place, like this one right here on October 3rd, 2018, this bottom right here on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2018, and just all these tops. Look at this one just right here, then this bottom. Does this have to do with the petrodollar recycling, in which they're making enough money to reinvest money and provide liquidity into the markets? And then when there's no profits, the money doesn't go into the market. So we've noticed that oil has already rolled over on itself and fallen completely, yet the stock market hasn't yet. Have we already reached the point of where there's just no profit and it doesn't make any difference, right? So if they're making a certain amount of profit or a certain amount of petrodollars surplus, and that gets reinvested back into the economy, into the United States economy, does that get cut off at $40? Is that where it just becomes zero? You know what I mean? There's no more surplus once the price of oil is at $40. So even if it went to $10, it wouldn't matter because we were already at zero at 40, if you follow what I'm saying. So, if the profit line is $40 and they make 50 and they get 50, right? So they have $10 worth of profit, and then some of that gets invested into the markets. Well, the second the price gets to 40, well, we've already hit zero. There's no more liquidity. There's no profit. It's over. And then once it goes down to 20, it still doesn't make any difference. It's not like it goes negative on itself. We hit the zero of reinvesting petrodollars once we got to 40, right? I don't know what that magic number is, but maybe that's why we didn't see the rollover again with oil, because we have already surpassed that moment in time of where profit is just gone. So as you know, the Federal Reserve has been printing money like crazy to help prop up markets. Could it be that it's because there's no money coming in from oil or the petrodollar? The liquidity that used to be there that was coming from oil sales and oil exporting is now no longer happening. We've lost that liquidity entirely. And without oil prices being higher, the United States economy is in trouble. And does that also threaten the petrodollar and the United States dollar as the world reserve currency? What faith do other countries have in that the United States is going to consider them as a priority over the United States considering itself a priority when you have a world reserve currency and your responsibility is to take care of the rest of the world? So, okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this one up. Boy, this was a long one, and I've been thinking about it all last night and all today to put it together for you, and I really just wanted to show you more about the petrodollar. I see a lot of people using the word petrodollar, and I'm just uncertain if it's really being used in the correct context. So I thought, hey, let me do some more research on the petrodollar and let me just present what I have found as well, so we could all kind of get a little bit of a refresher on it and understanding the implications of it. And it is really wild how all of these world events that are occurring right now all led to the oil crash, and then which also implicates the world reserve currency. It's kind of wild if you really think it of all of it, and you start to question, what's up with all of this? So, okay, today's an awesome day for this channel, because today we have hit 20,000 subscribers on this channel, and I'm very grateful for all of you. And it's been a wild ride for me to get to here. I want to just thank everybody for sticking through it all, and thank you, the listener, right now, sticking it out through the end of this video, because this one was kind of even a tough one, and sticking out with me through this channel and all these hard times we've had to deal with. But there's going to be green grass on the other side at some point, and we'll get there together. So I want to thank you so much for watching. Please like this video and give it a thumbs up. I really do appreciate the thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe so that way you could be notified of when I create new content and when I go live. As always, this is not investment advice. I'm not a financial advisor. But if you ever need a pick me up or a little bit of reassurance, just remember that the blockchain backers got your back. Have a good one.